Welcome to Ransom Church into week 7 of our series, Emotional Damage. Man, has this been a journey as we've spent 6 weeks just peeling back the layers of the onion and diving deep into our hearts and souls and exposing what's hidden underneath. Today is, I promise, meant to be a deep breath. And the reason I say meant to is because we're going to talk about the power of slowing down and discovering the rhythms of Sabbath in your life. And so the reason I say it's meant to be is because for you, this might be the most convicting one. So sorry about that if it is. But if you don't know what I mean by Sabbath, don't worry about that. We will define our terms here in a moment. But first I want to talk to you about your work. Whether your work is like a 9-to-5 job or perhaps multiple jobs or working to maintain your household for your family, whatever you do that you would call your work, I have a question I want to ask you this morning. Do you love your work? And I'm not asking if you're good at your work. I'm not asking how committed you are to your employer or your work. I am asking, how do you feel about your job? Sorry, we're still not getting away from talking about our feelings. How do you feel about your job? I'm asking, how does your work make you feel? And far too often when you ask people that question, you're going to get an answer that's something in the neighborhood of trapped, tired, worn down. In fact, we're going to have a little bit of fun here. We're going to play a bit of a comparison game, comparing your work with being in prison. Okay? Your work versus prison. We're going to see how many similarities we can identify here. So, in prison, you spend the majority of your time in a 10-by-10 cell. At work, many of you spend the majority of your time in an 8-by-8 cubicle. Okay? In prison, you are served 3 free meals a day. In work, you get a 15-minute break with 1 meal that you have to pay for. In prison, you can get time off your sentence for good behavior. At work, you get rewarded with more work for good behavior. In prison, you have some free time to watch TV and play games. At work, you might get fired for watching TV and playing games. In prison, you get your own toilet, or very worse, have to share it with your bunkmate. At work, you have to share the toilet with the people who always pee on the seat and leave the top up and to do all the things. In prison, you have to deal with a warden and be on your best behavior. Same rules apply at work, but they're called managers, right? Now, listen, I'm not advocating that prison is better than work. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's how many people feel about their job. This thing they have to do almost every day. And the thing that they have to do a huge chunk of almost every day. And so the goal of this series is to help people experience healing. And one of those areas we need healing is in the way we work, not in what we do, but in how we work. And in how we approach work, particularly in the United States. Americans have always had an unhealthy relationship with work. Pre-pandemic, 1/3 of Americans were working 45 hours or more a week, with around 8 million Americans putting in 80 hours or more a week, or 60 hours or more a week, rather. And many people having to work multiple jobs, so it does turn into 70 and 80 hours just to make ends meet. Now, then COVID hit, and some people worked less, but in a lot of ways, many people went into overdrive. We got rid of our commute. We leaned into technology like Zoom and Slack and emails, which blurred the lines between work and home. And for so many, work took over. And so it left people feeling burnout because they never feel like they can fully shut off work anymore. Now, part of moving through emotionally healthy spirituality in our lives is finding a balance between when we're working and when we aren't. And God knew that would be an issue for us, which is why He gave us a rule or a command about how we are to work, and He put it smack dab in the middle of His 10 commandments. So let's jump in, Exodus chapter 20, page 47, and let's define and outline what God means by Sabbath, okay? Exodus chapter 20, and by the way, if you don't have a Bible, you can raise your hand. The ushers would love to bring you one. If you don't own one, please keep it. It's our gift to you, but let's jump in, Exodus 20, starting with verse 8. Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them, but on the 7th day He rested. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. Now, I said I would define our terms. Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat. The word simply means to stop or to rest. How many of you have noticed in this series, this emotional damage series, that in order to do the hard work of naming your losses or paying attention to how you truly feel or getting a clue about your foo, your family of origin and dealing with that stuff from the past, have you realized that with any of that, in order to do it, you have to slow down? And God knew that too. And he wanted this, okay? And he also knew how bad we would be at slowing down, which is literally why he had to command us to rest, to stop, to embrace the limits, to take a deep breath, and to rest. And the Bible has a ton to say on this topic. There are 652 verses on how we're supposed to work, and 643 verses on the importance of Sabbath rest. Sabbath, this Ten Commandments isn't where this shows up for the very first time. It was actually an ancient rhythm. It was over 3,500 years old. This spiritual practice God gave to the Israelites as a gift after delivering them from slavery. Here, he's adding weight to how this is more than a suggestion. Sabbath is actually meant to be an act of resistance. And that act of resistance is against our tendency to never, ever, ever, ever stop. Think about this. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. Egypt's religion was intertwined with their economics, and the gods of Egypt demanded that Egypt had to be wealthy and successful, and as a result, there were no days off in Egypt, particularly not for the slaves. So Israel had lived for 400 years as slaves in that environment where it was work for 400 years until God rescued Israel from Egypt and then said, stop. Breathe. I am not like those phony Egyptian gods. I don't need your work. And he began to remind them about the creation story, and he gave them the gift of Sabbath rest. He reminded them, I designed the universe for work and rest, and he gave them the gift of Sabbath rest as an act of resistance against the false gods of this world that told them you have to be busy all the time. Here's why I believe this is relevant for us today when it comes to work and rest. America is less like Israel and more like Egypt. I think one of the reasons God put this in the Ten Commandments is because of how easy it is to forget the freedom we've been given. This command is so unique from the other commandments. Most of the other commandments are in the negative form, as in like, do not do these things. Not this one. This is the first command in a positive form. You need to do this. Remember the Sabbath, and the why is so critically important. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy, to build sacred time into your life to rest. And again, when we think of the Ten Commandments, we think of things we can't do, things God says no to. Do not murder. Do not steal. It's those types of things. But then there's this fourth command. God says, do something radical. Take the day off. And the irony of the whole thing is this is one command we never feel guilty of violating. It's easy to wonder why it's even in the Ten Commandments. I mean, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't murder. Those are pretty clear, but I never feel guilty for not resting enough. And yet God made it fourth in the Ten Commandments. I can just picture Moses and God laying these out and having the conversation, and God says, number one, no gods before me. And Moses is like, oh yeah, no brainer. Yeah, that makes total sense. Number two, do not have any idols. Oh, good one, God. I'm glad you thought of that one. Number three, do not misuse my name. Okay, no name in vain. Does that mean swear words? I don't know. But it makes sense. It makes sense. Number four, take the day off. What? Does that make the list? Are you sure? And we treat it the same way today, don't we? Of all the 10, it's the command we treat most lightly. And yet of all the 10 commandments, Jesus takes the idea of Sabbath very seriously. So let's zoom in and see what Sabbath truly is and what God's expectations are for us when it comes to Sabbath. Number one, Sabbath is God's plan for your rest. Okay? He actually planned for this. It's his plan for your rest. Verse 9 and 10, he says, you have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons or daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. Now, how many days do we work? 6 days, right? But on the seventh day, it's a day of what? Rest. And not just any rest, but rest dedicated to the Lord. Now, you hear that, and you can imagine that's led to a lot of legalistic views about how you spend your Sabbath, where we end up filling it with so many rules about what you can and cannot do, or when you take your Sabbath, or how you take your Sabbath, that it doesn't actually feel like rest anymore. It just feels like work. I'm working to rest, right? The Jews kept adding rules and regulations on how you're supposed to do your Sabbath until they ended up with a list of 1,521 things you can't do on the Sabbath. I'll give you some examples. You could not rescue a drowning person. You had to be like, sorry, bro, Sabbath, you know. You couldn't tie a rope to a bucket, okay? So here's the deal. You couldn't tie a rope to a bucket, but a woman could tie her girdle, okay? So often when they needed water, but they couldn't tie a rope to the bucket in the well, they would tie the woman's girdle and then lower that water bucket down in there. It's because they didn't want to break the Sabbath. If you were bitten by a flea, you had to allow it to keep biting you. You couldn't swat it, because if you killed it, you were guilty of hunting on the Sabbath. It wasn't sport, that was work, okay? And it wasn't just in biblical times that we heard these ridiculous things. Think about the founding of our nation. The Mayflower landed in Plymouth on a Saturday afternoon. They'd been on this boat for 13 weeks at sea. They were homesick, they were seasick, they were tired, yet despite their longing to go ashore, they said, we got to honor the Sabbath. So they spent all the rest of that day, that Saturday, prepping for service on the boat. And then they spent all Sunday in worship on the boat. Monday morning, they finally disembarked. They'd been there for 42 hours before they got off the boat. I mean, this is where you'll end up if you misunderstand the Sabbath. And there are modern versions of this for sure. They usually have to do with like not shopping or not eating out on Sunday. And yet Sabbath was never meant to be a list of rules. It was actually meant to be a gift to set you free to rest. Sabbath gives us an opportunity not only to stop working, but to stop wanting, to stop stressing, to stop chasing, to stop worrying. And by the way, just a note, that doesn't mean working is bad. The command is very clear. 6 days you work. Contrary to popular opinion, I'm sorry to tell you, work is not evil. Okay? Having a job is not a consequence of the fall. Actually, it was a gift. Before sin entered the world, God gave man the gift of work. In Genesis 2:15, it says, the Lord God placed the man in the garden to do what? To tend it and watch over it. Work is a gift from God to humanity, but so is rest. And that certainly doesn't mean the fall didn't have an effect. When Adam sinned, it fundamentally changed everything, right? And certainly work was no exception to this. When Adam and Eve sinned, work came under the curse of sin just like everything else. So in Genesis 3:17, we read this. To the man he said, since you listened to your wife and ate from the tree whose fruit I commanded you not to eat, the ground is cursed because of you. All your life you'll struggle to scratch a living from it. It will grow thorns and thistles for you. Though you will eat of its grains, by the sweat of your brow you'll have food to eat until you return to the ground from which you were made, for you were made from dust, and the dust you'll return. Here's the translation. Your work's going to be harder than it needs to be now. You ever found that? That often work is harder than it needs to be? That's because of sin, okay? But work itself isn't a curse. It's a great gift for us. God's intention for work was that we would work to earn a living and to bring glory to Him. Okay, but He wants to see us use our energy and our creativity to honor Him, to supply for our needs. But work isn't all we're supposed to do. 6 days you work, but the seventh day you're supposed to stop working. In other words, we are expected to work and we are expected to rest. And Sabbath is this 24 hours in the weekly calendar where we cease work and follow the example of our Creator who Himself rested. Here's what I think God is trying to refine out of us. Sabbath forces us to let go of the illusion that we are indispensable to running the world. I don't care what you do for a living. I don't care how important it seems. The world is not going to collapse without you doing that thing for a day. It can certainly handle, you can take a day of rest. As it turns out, God can run the universe without you and without me. Sabbath is about embracing our limits. It's about affirming God's in control and we're not. It's about acknowledging, guess what? The work is never, ever, ever, ever finished. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be. Yet we live in a culture that never rests, never sleeps, and it's costing us. Job-related stress is the leading cause of health problems in the United States. New England Journal of Medicine, in their health news, says that long-term job stress increases blood pressure. It increases the risk of coronary heart disease, that stress impairs our memory. It accelerates aging. It weakens the immune system. In other words, if we don't learn to slow down, it is literally going to kill us. Burnout seems to be at an all-time high regardless of age, and it's particularly affecting the millennial generation. I recently read a book by Anne Helen Peterson called Can't Even: How Millennials Became the Burnout Generation. And here's what I found out. What we're seeing is that people aren't burnout at work, people are burnout of life. Are you seeing that? Burnout is a symptom of overwork, and everything in life feels like work. You got to work at your health. You got to work at raising your kids. You got to work to get involved in your community. You got to work to do things for God. Then you got to work at work. So our activity for God actually outpaces being with God. And we end our days and our weeks exhausted from all our activities, only to go into overscheduled weekends already weary. Anne Helen Peterson wrote this in that book. She said, "We were raised to believe that if we worked hard enough, we could win the system, or at least live comfortably within it. But something happened. We looked up from our work and realized there's no winning the system when the system itself is broken. The common denominator between experiences remains the same. To succeed as a millennial kid, at least according to middle-class societal standards, was to build yourself for burnout." Can I just say that was never God's plan? God's plan for us is 6 days of real work, hard work, and 1 day of real rest. True rest, Sabbath rest. In my favorite book on Sabbath, Mark Buchanan, in The Rest of God, shares a statement that literally changed my life a few years ago. And it gave me permission that I needed to embrace Sabbath. He said this: "Sabbath is not the break we're allowed to take at the tail end of completing all our tasks and chores, the fulfillment of all our obligations. It's the rest we take smack dab in the middle of them, without apology, without guilt, and for no better reason than God told us we could." And I still get emotional. God said you can. He said you should. He said you need to. For some of you, that quote was the reason you needed to be here today. Sabbath is God's way of giving us rest. Number 2, Sabbath is God's way of helping us remember. Verse 8, "Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but let the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God." It's critical for us to not miss what God is saying here. Look at what God wants us to remember. Remember to observe the Sabbath by keeping it holy. In Hebrew, the word remember was more than just recalling a memory. It means to commemorate. It means to celebrate, like commemorating a birthday by throwing a surprise party. Remembering is what Sabbath is all about. It's about commemorating who he is, commemorating what he's done, commemorating that he's God and I'm not. So this command doesn't tell us not to do something. Instead it says, please take time to remember. In fact, rest was so important to God that he actually modeled it for us in creation. Now, we got to be very clear. God doesn't need a nap. God doesn't need a day off. Scripture says our Heavenly Father never sleeps nor slumbers. So he didn't get to the end of creation and think, whew, I'm beat. I need a break. Rest isn't something God requires for himself. And yet we read these words in Genesis 2, 1 through 3. So the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation, so he rested from all his work. Now listen, and God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy because it was the day when he rested from all his work of creation. See, God rested to remind us of our need to do the same. We are made in God's image. We are designed to reflect him. And when we take a rest, it honors how God made us to be, and it allows us to delight in him by enjoying the gift he gave us. The rest from hurrying, the rest from multitasking, to rest from decision-making and email, and to replace it all with whatever feeds our soul. And this is perhaps the most beautiful part of Sabbath. Sabbath was made for you. It was God's way of giving you permission to do the things in your life that replenish your soul, and it's different for all of us. For some, it's walking or hiking. Those are not mine. For some, it's eating great food. That is definitely one of mine. It's reading, it's taking a nap, and as you rest, and as you enjoy your rest, being thankful. Again, God didn't need rest, but he took time to delight. We read in Genesis 1:31, then God looked over all he made, and he saw, whew, that's very good. God took time to stop, to delight, to enjoy his accomplishment, and guess what? We're made to do the same, to delight in his gifts. Now, some of you are having a panic attack right now because first off, you're thinking, I delight in being busy. I delight in working. I can't imagine a day off being something that I want to do. You know, I heard someone once say Satan doesn't take a day off, and I thought, yeah, and he loses, and he's a big jerk to boot. So that didn't work out too well for him. But so some of you are going, I delight to work, and then the second you're panicking because you actually don't know what you delight in outside of work. It's been so long since you created space to rest that you actually don't know how you would do it. But here's the reality. To rest well takes a bit of planning. We tend to work and then come home and then crash on the couch until bedtime and just say, I'll leave everything to the weekend and I'll catch up then. Sabbath requires you to actually do your things during the week so that you can be intentional about taking time to rest so as not to overwhelm you. So let me share what this looks like in our lives, and I'll admit, this is something we used to do really regularly and really well, and we fell out of habit for a little while, and then actually our family suffered for it. And just recently, like in the last few months, we're getting on track again about this. This is not meant to be legalistic. You shouldn't do what we do. This is just meant to be freeing. This is just what this looks like in our lives, okay? So for us, our weekend, because of church on Sunday, our weekend is Friday, Saturday. So during the week in the evenings, we'll do laundry and fold laundry while watching a TV show. We'll sometimes go to the grocery store on a Tuesday night. But if we don't get all that done, what we do then is Friday, we spend the morning catching up and getting ready, and we've chosen for us Friday evening, 6 p.m. to Saturday at 6 p.m. is our Sabbath. So Friday morning, we do our unpaid work, the things we got to get done, so when we get to 6 p.m. Friday night, we can let go. Everything's good. We can pause. We can intentionally step away from everything and rest. There are weeks where we do this well. There are weeks where we don't do this well at all. That's okay. And if you're a parent with kids, little kids, or you're a single parent, give yourself some grace. You may not find a full 24 hours. That's okay. It's not about that. The key here is intentionality. For us, this usually means we order dinner on Friday or go out because I ain't cooking, right? It means movies. It means lazy Saturday mornings. It means pancakes, you know. I like to do outside work when the weather's good. We like to do projects around the house. Steph and I will often go on a walk together. That doesn't fulfill me, but it does fulfill her, and we'll do that together. And in doing all that stuff, I try to find some time to just stare out the window and just be with Jesus. Just some me and Jesus time where truly it's just him and me hanging out and nothing else matters. Now, you don't have to do that. That's our way of living this out. The question is, what brings you joy and delight? What God is inviting you into in the Sabbath is rest for your soul. It's space and permission to do the things that restore your soul, and it's critical to an emotionally healthy spiritual life. And God put it right in the middle of the Ten Commandments. You ever think about that? He literally etched it into stone tablets so we wouldn't forget. And yet that's exactly what the Israelites did. Did you know the Ten Commandments aren't in the Bible just one time? They actually show up a second time in Deuteronomy chapter 5. In Exodus 20 is when he first gave them the commandments on Mount Sinai. Deuteronomy 5 is their last year wandering in the wilderness where he's given them kind of a crash reminder course. And what's interesting is he gives a different reason for celebrating the Sabbath. In Deuteronomy 5, he writes this: you have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your oxen and donkeys and other livestock, and any foreigners living among you. All your male and female servants must rest as you do. Remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out with his strong hand and powerful arm. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to rest on the Sabbath day. Now again, God's message to his people is remember. In Exodus, he says, remember to observe the Sabbath day. In Deuteronomy, he says, remember you were once slaves. In Exodus, he says, remember God made you. In Deuteronomy, he said, remember God saved you. Both of these are a work of God. You didn't do either of them. Both of them remind us of our total dependence on him. Or let me say that a little differently. Both are a reminder that God is enough and that we can find our rest in him. So here's the deal. The central focus of Sabbath is worship. And that doesn't mean coming to church and singing songs, though that might be part of it. When we take time to slow down and remember and to bask in the love of our Father in our lives and to pause in the middle of everything and actually rest our souls, and when we carve out time to remember what Jesus did for us, then our Sabbath is actually truly an act of worship. And when we fail to allow ourselves to rest, we end up tying our identity to things like who we are and what we do and how we're seen by other people, what people think of us, and to everything in life except the most centrally important thing, which is God's love for us and his will for our lives. This isn't time off from God, it's time off with God. Our culture encourages and rewards overworking. It's absolutely a culturally acceptable sin, even in church. It's hard to stop, which is why God interrupts us, because the normal rhythm is work. Vacation for 2 weeks to try to catch work. Vacation for 2 weeks to try to catch up. And in contrast, Sabbath looks like this. Work, Sabbath. Work, Sabbath. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. On our Sabbath, we rest from work so that when the week begins, we can work out of a place of rest. We are relaxed, we're well rested, we're cooperating with divine rhythms. If you keep reading in Genesis 2, after God established rest, he planted a garden and he put Adam in charge of it and told him, get to work, and Adam did so out of his rest. This was a radical concept, by the way, when God introduced it. It's even more radical in 2023 in this current cultural moment. Society is having an existential crisis of burnout and overwhelm after worshiping for years at the idol of drivenness. We're realizing this is unsustainable and we cannot be emotionally healthy and have spiritual health if we don't rest. So in reality, Sabbath is about living free. God uses Sabbath to help you thrive, to become more in tune with him, for it's his spirit reminding you, I love you. Worth doesn't come from what you do, but from who you are. You're just a son or daughter of the Most High God. Sabbath is about receiving God's love apart from your work. It's about stopping the striving and realizing I have nothing to prove and just basking in his affection. If you put your faith in Jesus, the work's already finished on the cross. You don't have anything to prove. The first 3 commandments are all about how God is enough. And because God is enough, commandment 4 says, rest in that truth. And if I had to guess, I would say we're all in need of a Sabbath. It starts with the right choice right now to stop, to cease, to rest, to be still, and to know he's God. Pray with me. Father, be our rest. Give us rest. And help us give ourselves permission to rest in you. Amen.